Welcome back. Our next speaker recently joined Qualys, taking you through our Qualys Enterprise TruRisk Platform to help transform your risk management strategies. Please welcome the VP of Product Management for Qualys Enterprise TruRisk Platform, Mayuresh Ektare.
All right, looks like everyone is just getting seated here. So Sumit's keynote was amazing, and I actually have a story to extend what he mentioned about, the scenario that he was talking about, the airplanes. Now, interestingly enough, I know that you all must be wondering, it wasn't me who checked in the luggage. Okay, just wanted to clear the air up here. But anyways, to extend that analogy a little further, I was also flying out from San Jose Airport coming to San Diego. And interestingly, our flights were canceled. I also had a colleague along with me who was on the same flight. But I wanted to share this experience in terms of how situational context can lead you to take different actions. So I had to be here first thing 8 o'clock in the morning to meet many of you. That wasn't the situation with the colleague of mine. So we had completely different remediation plans in place, right? He took a 6 a.m. flight next day in the morning, but I couldn't take that chance if the fog didn't clear up by then. So instead, took a flight to LAX, drove here at 3 a.m. in the morning. But I just wanted to bring that in front of everyone, that context plays a deep role when we are really trying to figure out how to respond to a situation. When both of us were put in the same situation, our approaches could be dramatically different. But anyways, without further ado, let's dive right in. I'm going to touch base upon a few things. What led the industry to really have a need for a risk operations center? Sumit actually cued us in really very well to the need for a risk operations center. But what are some of the industry trends that we observe that have sort of led to this point? The attack surface is expanding extremely rapidly. Dial back 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and all we had to do was scan the infrastructure and patch the assets. However, that infrastructure now has software deployed on it. Oftentimes, there is a custom software that is being built by many organizations. Regardless of which vertical industries are in, healthcare, manufacturing, oil and gas, everyone is a software manufacturing powerhouse now. And with the modern cloud-native architectures that are being utilized, we see a bunch of new digital asset types that are supposed to be managed from a security perspective as well as the asset management perspective. And these could be anything from your APIs to cloud workloads to containers to identities, LLMs, secrets, certificates, what have you. Now, the security industry has responded really graciously by creating a specialized tool to secure each one of these asset types. And that is where those 10 dashboards that Sumit talked about really come about, right? An average enterprise today has over 70 different security tools. This is a nightmare for many organizations to really manage. This rapid digital transformation has sort of led towards the rise of this specialized tooling. And the soup of alphabets is really endless, from VM solutions to CSPM, ISPM, DSPM, SSPM. All of these security posture management tools are doing essentially proactive risk management. They're trying to identify the vulnerabilities, misconfiguration, and really identify how do you prioritize those in a grand scheme of things. The second most important trend that we see is that the role for vulnerability management team is rapidly evolving in an organization. From scanning and patching, they are really becoming the orchestrators of risk. Now, as we saw with dozens of different security tooling that is being put in place, these telemetries of risk really need to be aggregated to create a continuous risk operations. Security teams oftentimes are not in the business of remediating. They are essentially leaning upon your IT teams or developers or IoT, OT asset owners to really go and remediate those findings. However, they are really becoming the brains, the orchestrators of that risk. They need to, you wouldn't need a risk operations center if you could actually fix all the findings that your tools are able to identify and discover. Many of you are dealing with millions and millions of findings. Some of our large customers have 50 million, 100 million findings that they have to deal with. In scenarios like these, when you can't really mitigate them all, how do you really prioritize what means most to your business? And how do you surface those risks that will have a meaningful impact on your business? That is where the vulnerability management teams are best placed in an organization from a proactive risk management perspective to really centralize the function, pull in the security posture data from multiple different tools, apply business context, apply threat intelligence to really understand the impact, and then coordinate their response around those. Vulnerability management teams are essentially moving on from scanning and patching to really becoming the centralized cyber risk operations in an organization. Now, why now is the question, right? The problem has existed for quite some time. Why now? The data really speaks for itself. When you really look at it, there has been a 30% increase in new vulnerabilities that have been identified. And yet, on the other side, we see 70% reduction in the time needed to actually exploit those vulnerabilities. When we see such data points, you really have to figure out the coordinated response for these vulnerabilities is oftentimes missing in an organization. And we can see that from the data breaches that have been occurring. 56% of the data breaches have been identified just simply because there isn't a coordinated response to the security posture data that has been aggregated in an organization. So that is where the need for a risk operations center really comes about. I really wanted to talk about how Qualys is, for the first time, actually opening up the platform. No longer in ETM or Risk Operations Center are you simply going to look at Qualys findings. The alphabet soup that we talked about earlier, all these different security posture management tools are essentially generating that risk data, which really needs to be acted upon. Now, the strategy, as much as we would like you all to use every single Qualys module that we offer, the reality on the ground is that you'll always have a multi-vendor strategy. You'll have different tools scanning different parts of your infrastructure, whether it is cloud, whether it is identity, or whether it is your data security. The goal of a risk operations center is not really a single vendor strategy. The goal is unified orchestration. How do you achieve that unified orchestration is through the risk operations center. For the first time, we are opening up the Qualys platform to really ingest third-party data from any of these tools so that you can actually bring those onto the same risk plane, normalize that data set, and really create a coordinated response around that. So today, I wanted to just identify how is risk handled today in the organization. Now, when it comes to a security operations center, as Sumit was mentioning, threat data, threat events are all aggregated into a SOC for a coordinated response. Essentially, you're trying to figure out what are the indicators of compromise and really create a coordinated incident response plan around it. But when it comes to risk, risk is being addressed independently for each one of those tools. 10 different dashboards, each dashboard generating top 10 findings. Response is actually driven based on those dashboards. What we are really looking forward to is really creating a very similar analogy on the risk side. This is pre-boom, right? That was a really good analogy, by the way, in the morning at the keynote. What we do post-boom, we need to also implement that on the pre-boom side. The risk data looks a lot different than the event data on this response side, on the threat detection side. This is a time series data. The time series data needs to be coordinated, collected, correlated to identify the root cause of an attack. This is a breach that has already happened. But what happens on the left side here is really you are looking at the security posture data. This is more of a graph data. It's not a time series data. The technologies that are really required to stitch it all together to understand the relationships of these data sets is really unique and different. And that is where a risk operations center really comes about, where we are indeed looking into the pre-attack risk reduction scenarios. So there are a couple of foundational elements to building up a risk operations center. There are three key types of data sets that are ingested into a risk operations center. The first one is your raw security data, the security posture data that we talk about. Essentially, these are ingested into a risk operations center by means of establishing a connection with the tool of your choice, bringing in the raw security data, findings, vulnerabilities, what have you. The second important area is threat intelligence. How do you really bring in the knowledge of the threat landscape and overlay that on the aggregated risk data? These could be essentially your CISA kevs. These could be your weaponized exploits that might be out there. How do you bring in all of that knowledge and overlay that on the security data that you have aggregated and normalized? And the third thing is the business context. Now, this is, no one else in the industry would have this other than your teams internally. And this comes in all shapes, sizes, form factors, right? CMDBs could be one source of it, but oftentimes organizations have custom data sources that could provide the business context. How do you take that business context and really ingest that into a risk operations center to make sense of all of that, to generate three key outcomes? Now, in any organization, as Sumit was already mentioning, there are multiple different functions. Essentially, they're analyzing the same data set for different outcomes. CTEM, CISOs are oftentimes looking at the same data set, aggregated millions of findings to really figure out, with the limited resources that I have, what are some of the things my team needs to work on today, right now? Forget about the 100 million findings that I have, but what should my team work on today? Like, I want to identify, here are the 100 things that we are going to patch today. CTEM. The second thing that we are customers are looking for is cyber risk quantification. What does it mean from a business perspective, right? What is the impact of an exploit on my organization? Can I organize my data sets into business entities so that I can report, track risk in a more material way inside my organization? The purpose of cyber risk quantification is also to transfer the risk. Understanding, here is my total risk. How can I really remediate, mitigate the ones that we can? How can I accept the certain type of risk? And how can I transfer the residual risk to a cyber insurance company? And finally, last but not the least, is the automated compliance. Oftentimes, regulatory compliance is also a business risk, right? And that the compliance is oftentimes tracked using the same data set. Our goal with introducing Risk Operations Center is to really build out these three capabilities on top of a single unified platform, essentially creating a single source of truth across the entire organization that assembles security posture data. Doesn't matter which asset type it belongs to, doesn't matter which tool you are using in your organization. With that, I really wanted to highlight one of the thoughts from the industry as well. Our friend here, Corey, was gracious enough to provide a brief comment about how he looks at Risk Operations Center. Audio is missing, please.
All different threat intel, all the platforms they have.
I'm going to play it again.
In my years as an industry professional, I've seen where companies spend countless number of hours, multiple resources, plugging in all of their feeds from all different threat intel, all the platforms they have that are scanning for vulnerabilities, looking for other threats. What the industry is thirsty for is a risk operations center where you have an outside entity taking care of all of that API management, looking at all of the other new technologies to integrate in. And really, as a business professional, all we have to do is look at our dashboards, be able to identify the most critical risks at the time, and then go and action off of that.
Wonderful. I actually wanted to do a small exercise here. How many of you pull out data from your scanning tools into a data lake of your own? Show of hands, please. I can see about more than 50%, 60% of you, actually. That tells you something. right? There is a reason why you pull out that data, because you need to correlate that data with other data sets that you have accumulated in your organization. This is where we really wanted to launch the ETM as a solution that sort of allows you to natively do that within the Qualys platform. It provides you with a unified view of your risk posture, which is automatically enriched with the built-in threat intelligence feeds to really help you prioritize the millions of findings that your organizations have to deal with. Now, the risk can be identified generically in 3 different buckets. Traditionally, you have your IT infrastructure, you have your cloud infrastructure, and then there is your application security stack that is running on it. When you look at your traditional infrastructure, you have got your vulnerability management tools covering that. When it comes to your cloud infrastructure, you have got your CNAPP solutions covering and identifying the risk around that. But when it comes to your applications, there are quite a few tools that are being deployed throughout the entire CI/CD process, to identify the risk at every stage of your software development lifecycle. Whether it is your SAST, DAST, SCA, IAC, pentest, what have you, these are all risk signals that still need to be aggregated so that you can understand and correlate what those mean from a business entity perspective. Can I stitch all of this data together for a given business entity and have a true risk score generated for that business entity? Some of you actually believe in transparency. Many of the organizations actually expose this data internally so that you can actually foster a healthy competition, right, to reduce the risk around the business entities. We like to call it wall of risk. Some people call it wall of shame to drive remediation. But the idea is how do you really aggregate the risk data that you have and really correlate with the way you want to report the risk on, measure and report on it. So there are a couple of aspects to building out the comprehensive risk operations center, starting off with the unified asset inventory. Without an inventory, nothing really, you wouldn't be able to take any action. Essentially, every single finding that you have in your organization really has a target, and that target is an asset. That asset could be anything, whether it is a host, a container, an identity, a secret, a certificate, whatever that is. But without a comprehensive unified asset inventory, you wouldn't really be able to make sense of the risk data that is coming your way. Which brings us to the next part. How do you consolidate the risk data into a single plane so that you can normalize the risk? Different tools identify risk on a different scale. Some might identify it high, medium, low. Some might identify it on a scale of 1 to 5. Some might do it on a scale of 1 to 10. How do you really normalize all of that into a Qualys' native platform? Considering all of these signals coming in and really normalizing, centralizing it into a unified architecture. Finally, looking at the threat data once it is, once the risk factors are aggregated, we really are looking at enriching that with the threat intelligence feed. Qualys natively has over 25 threat intelligence feeds that we subscribe to in our backend to help curate that data set and enrich these vulnerabilities and findings so that you will be able to use those for prioritization purposes. Business context we really talked about earlier, but I can't stress upon how important it is to really bring in this data. No one else in the security industry would have this other than your teams, right? Oftentimes you'll see in the demo very shortly, this can be brought in from your CMDB solutions or any middleware that your organization might actually have internally. Finally, prioritizing it. By overlaying the business context, applying the threat intelligence on top of the aggregated security data, you would be able to use multiple different prioritization templates that Qualys actually provides out of the box to help you identify which risk might be more meaningful and impactful for your organization. Now, one thing about business context is, again, impact. Sumit talked about the impact in terms of $ups, right? Understanding the financial impact of a breach is really important when it comes to business context. And the solution really allows you to define the cyber risk quantification, either manually or through a simple calculator that would allow us to estimate the potential impact of the breach should that happen on those assets. Finally, the risk response. Reporting on the risk is great, but it doesn't do anything. The risk is a risk until it is remediated. So there can be multiple different responses that you can actually define on that risk. The most important thing is obviously, can you really patch? Can you really remediate that risk? But the second part to it is, if you're not able to patch a certain asset for maintaining a business continuity, you might be able to create a compensating control around it. These are all valid responses to a risk. The third action you could potentially take is accept the risk, right? The fourth action you could take is potentially create an exception, defer the risk for future. The fifth action you could take is really transfer that risk over for cyber insurance. All of these are valid responses to the risk, and they really depend on what is the context, what is the situational context of that particular finding, of that particular vulnerability, where does that vulnerability reside, what is the impact should something bad happen. All of those things are taken into consideration to create a coordinated response. And finally, compliance. As we discussed earlier, regulatory needs are also business risk. So I wanted to dive a little deeper into the architecture of ETM as an offering. As you can see here, obviously, the Qualys data sources are natively integrated into a risk operations center, the ETM offering. But now we are also bringing in data from other tools. The list can be endless here. Vulnerability management, cloud, endpoint security, application security, and many more. This data is actually flowing into the ETM platform for the purposes of the risk orchestration that we discussed earlier. Essentially, consolidation of that data, risk data, contextualization of that data, normalization, the normalization of the data, correlation, threat intelligence, and response. At the very top, you'll see the response. What are the different types of responses, right? As we discussed, you could patch, you could mitigate, create compensating controls, or you could actually ticket it out. If you don't have Qualys patch management deployed on it, you could actually create tickets, push it out to ServiceNow, Jira, and have the respective owners of those assets remediate those findings. Now, without further ado, let's dive right into the product itself. I want to give you a brief demo of the solution, so you actually see this in action. No longer slideware. So let's go right in. When ETM is launched, it will be available as an additional module within the Qualys platform. For many of you who already have Qualys solution, the onboarding is a very simple process, a 3-step onboarding process. All right? It really takes you to a very quick process of building your background, which Qualys already has. It is already filled in. What you can also do here is identify what the risk appetite looks like. I gave an example of a situation when I was flying out here. The risk appetite for me was very low. Right? I had to get here before my meetings. Risk appetite could be different for someone else, right? Based on that, you can actually identify what the threshold for the organization as a whole is. And you can also define this as a business entity level as well. And we'll go there in a minute. So let's create the business entities themselves. This data is automatically getting populated. So with the CMDB connectors that we have, we pull in this data into the Qualys platform to create the business entities around how you'd report risk in your organization. Obviously, you have the ability to actually go and edit one of them. Let's pick the checkout app. This is interesting because we are not just bringing in the business entities, but we are also bringing in ownership attribution. Now, ownership attribution is critical. Having a finding and wanting to remediate it doesn't do anything until you actually have an owner assigned with it, right? So bringing in this ownership information, risk owner as well as the remediation owner, is really critical. With that information coming in, you go to the next step of really quickly identifying the dollar value, right? This is where the cyber risk quantification really comes in. Now we are looking at the checkout app. Maybe that app is the most important app for your organization. How do you really identify what should the dollar loss magnitude be for this? So here you can actually identify what is the loss type, data breach. I can actually use this basic calculator to very quickly identify, here are the number of records that I have in this application. And we, using the industry standards, can calculate the impact that it might have on your environments. You can populate different types of data loss types: ransomware, SaaS compromise, business email compromise, and associate a dollar value with each one of them. Now, risk appetite can also be defined at the business entity level, which is really important. Let's reduce it down to 400 because that's one of our important apps. This is an interesting area. You'll see these are some of the last step in the onboarding process, but you'll see there are multiple different connectors that are listed here. But a couple of them are recommended. How do we recommend these connectors? We already have a Qualys agent on many of your hosts. So we identify and we know which services are being deployed or already deployed on those. Those are the recommended ones. So let's go ahead and say, I want to configure Wiz as a connector. When I click configure now, it takes me to a very quick two-step process. Identify the instance of your Wiz, provide your credentials, and bring in the data. This is important now because we discussed earlier, different tools identify risk in different terms. They measure the risk differently. Now, this screen really allows you to map the risk to QDS, right? The values are automatically mapped to begin with. You don't have to do anything. The defaults are already in place. But should you want to customize how these risks need to be sort of ingested into Qualys, you do have the ability to do so. Once the normalization is done, that's all you need to do for bringing in the data from a third-party connectors. Now, I wanted to show you something interesting. Oftentimes, business context resides in different data models internally in an organization, or even take a use case of pen testing. Pen testing results are oftentimes provided in CSV files. How do you ingest that data set in a completely automated fashion into Qualys? I'm going to take an example of a generic connector, CSV connector. Let's drag and drop a file. What Qualys does now is it interprets that file, and our AI identifies what the mapping for that should look like. It automatically scans the file for key value pairs, identifies the source fields, and maps it automatically to the destination fields. Obviously, you can go and fine-tune it, but you'll see the power of AI here that we bring to the forefront in allowing you to very quickly ingest any kind of data into ETM. Now that we have configured our sources, let's let the system do its thing. What it's going to do now is first aggregate the data from multiple sources, deduplicate them, enrich them with threat intelligence, calculate the TruRisk score, and finally generate insights and intelligence. So there we are. We are looking at the dashboard for checkout application. This is actually the entire organization. So we can see the TruRisk score is 860. This is really important. Sumit presented a chart similar to this. I wanted to sort of identify, at the bottom, you're really looking at your different applications, business entities. The green bars identify the risk appetite. The red bars are identifying the actual TruRisk score for each one of those business entities. Now, this data in itself is telling you a lot, right? Where you have pretty high deviation. But when you overlay the business context and the impact of financial impact of an exploit within that business entity, now you actually have a completely different picture. I would definitely want to go and dig deeper into the checkout application because that happens to be the most important application in my organization. Let's go right in. All right. Why is there a spike? Why do we see the checkout application suddenly spiking up over there? And what is really provoking me to look into that? So as you can see here, 80K new findings have been added recently. That has sort of increased the risk score for the checkout application. Let's go into the checkout app itself. So now we are actually changing the lens of how we are looking at that data. This is a dashboard specifically for one of your business entities. Now, the risk is 750. The loss magnitude has already been defined during our onboarding process. But we want to get to the details of the insights from the findings and vulnerabilities. As you can see here, the true risk for the entire checkout app is 750. Very quickly, you'll see where are these risk factors coming from. Multiple different sources, including. This is interesting. So when we aggregate the risk from multiple sources, we have to really figure out whom do they apply to. Majority of the risk happens to be on my hosts. So let's drill down into the hosts and see what is really contributing to that risk. Those are the vulnerabilities. 68% of the risk is really coming from vulnerabilities on those hosts. Let's look at what the contributing risk factors. What are really the risk factors that are really generating those vulnerabilities? I can see weaponized vulnerabilities, CISA kevs. What I don't see here is the identity risk. I must have forgotten that during setting up a connector. So let's bring in the identity angle into this. Let's go ahead and quickly create a connector for identities. Let's say in my organization, I use Active Directory, Okta. Let's set that connector up. And what it's going to do is bring that data in to show you the weak credentials now. You can see it's no longer simply about findings on a host. We are really going beyond the asset type here to bring in information from different angles and really aggregating them to show you a comprehensive picture for a given business entity. Risk needs to be tracked, managed at the business entity level, as opposed to tracking for a domain, identity, or cloud, or hosts. Let's keep going further. The clicker is not working. Hopefully it does. Still no signal. There you go. All right. So those were the different types of risk factors that we were aggregating. We brought in the identity data. But those, I really wanted to go deeper into what the risk factors really mean. And there are quite a few that come out of the box within Qualys' platform, but you can actually create your own. Let me take a scenario to explain what risk factors really mean within the Qualys platform. You can create a new risk factor. Now, scenario could be, I've got an asset with high risk vulnerability on it. It also happens to be external facing asset. And it is supposed to be a PCI compliant asset. Now, independently, these three signals don't mean much. But when you put them together, that risk needs to be elevated to the highest possible level. How do you do that? By creating risk factor. These are the toxic combinations of multiple different signals that you can actually put together to create a rule so that you can modify the risk score for that finding, either in a static fashion by assigning a QDS score to it, or dynamically, which is raising it by a certain percentage points. When you're looking at millions and millions of findings, this becomes like a very, very important tool to surface the risk that matters the most. So now that we have configured a new risk factor, my risk has actually jumped to 885. We also know what the loss magnitude looks like. So clearly, we need to take an action here. So let's ask AI to generate some insights for this. What we can quickly see is I am probably doing not too good if my risk exceeds 39% of my industry peers. Right? This data is really coming because initially we have captured information during the onboarding stage about which vertical do you belong to. So we look at the industry verticals, the size, the region, the geography that you operate in, and really benchmark on the peer level, where do you stand? We have top insights coming in, as well as recommendations in terms of what do you do with that risk? How do you really prioritize? When we start prioritizing that risk, this really allows you to select a remediation plan. Now, you have got a couple of remediation plans that come out of the box within the platform. Whether you want to reduce the risk as much as you can, whether you want to have a quick win with the least operational impact, or you want to just simply get ahead of your patch Tuesday, right? Depending on what you're really looking after, let's go ahead and select quick win. It quickly shows you what is the impact of that, how many assets do I need to touch if I choose that plan. You can also modify, edit that plan, customize it for your liking. But we'll select quick win and let the system do its thing. What you see now is that plan has been applied to all the millions of findings that we have aggregated from multiple different tools for prioritization. And the system has come up with the list of findings that you need to remediate for reducing your risk from 885 to 510. Let's go ahead and select all right. The clicker is clearly not working. Thank you. All right. So let's go ahead and select one of the vulnerabilities here. As you can see, there are two sources, VMDR and Wiz. We can actually go ahead and see the details for that QDS. I want to make a brief pause here. You'll see the CVSS score for this is 6.7. However, there is a weaponized exploit. That means there is a threat actor who has actually exploited the vulnerability here, the known exploit. And that is why the risk QDS score here is 95, and it is critical, though the CVSS was 6.7. We can also go into the sources. That is an aggregated record, but you can also go into the sources to identify what data is actually being sent by VMDR versus Wiz. So all of that data is natively aggregated, collected. Now that we have our remediation plan here, we know that these vulnerabilities need to be fixed for me to reduce my risk from 885 to 510. Let's ask AI to actually summarize this plan for us. What it quickly does is tells me I've got 3.4K assets that need to be patched or they need to be touched, right? It gives me a very quick summary, but it also lets me know that 21% of my risk, majority of my risk, is actually stemming from vulnerabilities or misconfigurations on critical hosts that are supposed to be PCI compliant, right? What I can do now is quickly ask the system to also include misconfigurations to be included in my remediation plan. With that, my risk is going to further reduce. I'm going to ask the system, how do I fix these findings? The system automatically generates a remediation plan for me. Let's look at what that remediation plan looks like. The remediation plan itself is getting summarized. At the top where you're looking at, these are the vulnerabilities that can effectively be patched by Qualys because we have patch management deployed on those assets. The second bucket you're looking at is, though you may not have a patch available or you may not want to deploy the patch, could you potentially create a compensating control to protect against the potential threat? The third thing, could be raising an exception. Would you want to raise an exception to defer that risk or accept that risk? And finally, last but not the least, is we also identify what are the assets on which you do not have Qualys agent deployed. For these assets, you might want to create a remediation plan by integrating with your ticketing system and assigning it to the rightful owners. Let's go ahead and remediate. As we remediate, a new patch job is being created. As we patch the systems, now we can actually automate the remainder. Whether we want to create a compensating control, whether we want to raise an exception, or we want to create tickets in the system. Now we can actually automate all of that using Qflow. And these automation flows, workflows, will automatically be triggered whenever we see the similar data sets happening. Now that we have ran through that automation, what we see is my risk score has now reduced to 380. And that is pretty neat. Risk is a risk until you take an action. We just took an action. My risk has now reduced down. But I do want to make sure that I am indeed notified the next time the risk rises about the threshold that I've already set. So let's go ahead and quickly configure an alert. This alert, once I configure, will notify me whenever the risk is above the threshold that we set up in the onboarding phase. Qualys is also going to be launching a companion mobile app, TruLens. So you don't necessarily have to be glued to your monitors. You actually have that notification come in on your mobile app. It also further allows you to go deeper into the app itself to see what the TruRisk looks like from a holistic perspective. You can drill down into each one of your business entities to see the details of your risk, aggregated risk across all of your asset types. This is what I really wanted to share with you. If you can switch back to the slides, please. Hope you all enjoyed the demo. The product is in action right now. It is available as we speak. You can definitely try this out and aggregate all of your risk within the Qualys platform. I want to take a moment to really highlight why Qualys is best positioned to deliver a ROC, a Risk Operations Center. Now, Qualys happens to be the only tool in the market, in the industry, that actually does this end-to-end. From scanning, identification of the risk across multiple different asset types, to now aggregation through ETM, allowing you to really bring in threat intelligence, business context, opening up the platform for prioritizing the right way for your organization. And finally, taking it one step further to remediation. Patching, creating compensating controls, ticketing with the systems that you already have in place, and creating these connections. Essentially, true risk management is an orchestrator of risk. Security teams have been evolving to take a role of an orchestrator as opposed to tactical operations. We really believe Qualys is the only comprehensive platform that provides an end-to-end offering, from scanning all the way to actually doing something about those misconfigurations and vulnerabilities. Your largest vulnerability data, risk data, already resides within Qualys platform. So many of you who raised your hands earlier when I was asking have been moving data out of Qualys into a data lake of your choice, having a team of dozen engineers put that data set together, stitch it with other attributes that you find across the organization to generate insights. No longer would you have to do that. Majority of your data, if 75–80% of your data already resides within Qualys, bring in the remainder, and you will have a comprehensive view of your risk within the platform. And finally, last but not the least, is now that you don't have to deal with this movement of the data, you pretty much have a near real-time access to that data set from a risk management perspective. Right? Oftentimes, Many of you who raised your hand earlier know the pain associated with moving a huge amount of data into a data lake. As you pull in this data into your data lake, you also need to manage the connections. Obviously, you're pulling in the data from different APIs. Many vendors, when they change the APIs, your teams need to go back, update your entire data pipelines so that your reporting analytics still functions. That is all natively taken care of by Qualys within this platform. With the dozens and dozens of connectors that we have available within the platform, no longer would your teams ever have to worry about, is the data being actually pulled in the right way into Qualys's platform? How does that data map into the Qualys's data model? That is all natively handled for you. All you need to do is bring in your business context in terms of how do you feel like organizing this data for reporting purposes, and really focus on utilization of data rather than managing the data pipeline itself. Offload that to Qualys. Qualys really is positioned really great to provide the comprehensive risk operations center in this market. With that, I wanted to wrap it up. And wow, right on time, I think. So hope you enjoyed this. The product is already available. Sign up for interest to try the solution out. Me and my team would be definitely excited to walk you through this journey of implementing a ROC. Take advantage of the partners that we have here who are really bringing in the industry best practices to enable this end-to-end concept of establishing a risk operations center in your organization. With that, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mayuresh.